The medium of horror is a perplexing one. Not many other genres are as seamlessly transferable across virtually all types of media currently in existence and to such great effect. From books to movies to music, I'm sure that we can all think of at least a couple of examples of some works that evoke a sense of horror. And of course, there's also the unique feeling of dread that comes from a good horror video game. But of late, sentiment has really changed around horror games, especially those from larger studios or developers. More than ever, there seems to be a feeling that horror is becoming contrived. And so one of the big trends we've seen in the last couple of years is that more and more people are paying attention to smaller horror developers, and really just smaller developers as a whole. The popularity of games like Lethal Company are in many ways indicative of this, but another developer that's received a lot of attention recently is Mike Klubnika. A solo game dev who began publishing his works on itch.io in 2020, Klubnika has quickly made quite a name for himself in the realm of horror video games. His works stand out for their unique, low-poly visuals combined with a grungy, rusting aesthetic indicative of industry and urban rot. His games are compelling for the worlds that they instantiate and the role we play within them, and this isn't the first time that I've sung his praises on this channel. A little over a month ago, I put out a video about the ARG, which is still ongoing in his game Buckshot Roulette, a title that you're probably at least passingly familiar with. But ever since researching that video, I've been wondering about something, and it all stems from a Q&A that was conducted as part of the ongoing promotion for Buckshot Roulette's Steam release. In that Q&A, where Mike talked primarily about his philosophy for designing the game and things of that nature, there was one simple question that really stood out to me. Does the game take place in the same universe as previous games? To which Mike simply answered yes. And I'll admit, it sent me down a rabbit hole of game analysis and speculation in order to see if there's any heads or tails we could make of this claim. Is there anything in Mike's games that point to a cohesive narrative or timeline? And what I found over this last month of research is certainly surprising. So today, I want to take you on a journey through derelict hulls, vast industrial superstructures, and across spaces beyond our comprehension. This is a journey through the interconnected worlds of Mike Klubnika. But before we get started talking about the rest of today's fictional worlds, allow me to introduce you to the fantasy realm of Teleria, thanks to Raid Shadow Legends, who've been kind enough to sponsor today's video. With intense action, quality PvE and PvP content, and over 800 unique collectible champions, I'm sure that we've all heard of Raid in the past. But from now until November 22nd, Raid is running one of its biggest events to date, the Asgard Divide. During this event, players can partake in a ton of in-game activities, including a limited-time event dungeon, and pick up 4 strong new champions, all representing Raid's creative take on prominent figures from Norse mythology. These include Thor, Odin, and Freya, who can be collected by completing different goals during the event, and of course, Loki, who you can get super easily just by logging into Raid for 7 days between now and October 23rd. All of these characters further flesh out Raid's lore, which is actually something that I like most about the game. Unlike many similar games, Raid has a ton of opportunities for you to get into the story, from the expansive campaign, to the lore stories tab, to the beautiful Call of the Arbiter animated series, and that's something that I can really get behind. If you want to join in and see everything Raid has to offer, then by using my link in the description or the QR code on screen, all new players will immediately get 100,000 silver and the epic champion Lightsworn. Then, once you reach level 15, you'll get yet another epic champion, Juliana. And if that's not enough, once in-game you can join my official clan, the Everbards. So, what are you waiting for? Join millions of other players on PC or mobile today, and get started with Raid for absolutely free. Thank you once more to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video, and with that, let's get back into it. So, before we set out to establish any form of chronology between KLUBNIKA'S games, we first need to ask ourselves a simple question, and that is, what games are we even talking about in the first place? In his 4 brief years on itch.io, Mike has around 20 games under his belt, which is incredibly impressive, even when we consider that most of these games can usually be played to completion in under half an hour. All that we know for sure is that some of these titles take place within a shared universe, but the matter of which ones could be connected and which cannot is a little bit harder to define. When first researching this topic myself, there were two categories of games that I almost immediately discounted for a couple of reasons respectively. The first are Mike's very few non-horror titles, and other non-game stuff like the low-poly Tools and Weapons resource pack. This category includes Tile Jump, the first ever game uploaded on his itch.io page, and a couple of others such as Lab Run, which actually overlaps with the next excluded category. And those are games that were created for entry into game jams. For those that may not know what a game jam is, it's essentially a sanctioned event where both new and existing developers are welcomed to spend a relatively short amount of time, usually only a couple of days, putting together a small game generally centered around some kind of theme. Sometimes game jams offer a cash prize to their most popular or highly rated entry, but sometimes they purely exist for fun and to help creators generate new and exciting ideas. Many of KLUBNIKA'S earlier titles were created in this fashion, and although some of them, like Film Morbid and Remember, are phenomenal examples of the types of games Mike would go on to be most well known for, the fact of the matter is that these games were either collaborative efforts or very simple in the way of story, to the point where there's not really any reasonable way for us to tell whether or not it exists within a broader context, unless Mike himself were to come out and say so. This leaves us with an admittedly still pretty robust catalog of many of Mike's most prestigious self-published works, including games like Carbon Steel, The Other Side, Concrete Tremor, Unsorted VHS, and of course, Buckshot Roulette, just to name a few. But it was within many of these remaining games that I found a through line that eventually formed the basis for the creation of this entire video. You see, almost every single one of the games that we're left with here, except for just 3, have definitive canonical dates in which they take place, or at least vague spans of time that make it possible to place them with respect to one another. This is the criteria which today we're going to hone in on, and which we're going to use in order to create a sort of emergent timeline of overarching KLUBNIKA lore, so to speak. With that in mind, what I'm hoping to do in this video is to explore each of the games in chronological order, and hopefully this can give ourselves and the rest of the community a starting point to continue trying to piece together what exactly Mike meant in this seemingly innocuous little response. So without any further ado, let's jump right in to our first game. When you think indie horror game, chances are that something like Unsorted VHS is probably what comes to mind. In this game, our unnamed protagonist finds themselves hanging from the ceiling of a small room with a box of old VHS tapes, and a mysterious voice telling us to look through them in order to discover how we got here. There are 5 tapes in total, and we'll have to go through each of them in order to piece together what's going on. While this isn't likely the order that you'd choose to play through the tapes on your own, I think that the third cassette, labeled Cabin Anomaly Investor Briefing, is probably the best place to start, as it gives us a solid idea about the premise of this world, and because, while all of the other tapes are playable, this one is, well, an actual video cassette. You just go ahead and watch it. The cassette opens with a copyright notice from the film's producers, the Scepter Foundation, before we view a short briefing involving a set of cabins that are somehow imbued with a strange power. It's never stated why or how, but by entering one of these cabins and closing the door, it's possible to teleport instantaneously between them, and those who enter one cabin will always exit from another. We're told that there are 5 cabins in total, but there used to be 6, with the 6th missing branch now known as the Unmarked Location. The video makes it clear that the cabin used to be here by showing us its leftover foundations, before abruptly addressing a strange symbol in the middle of the cabin ring with seemingly alien origin, a part of which is thought to point to the Unmarked Location. And that pretty much concludes the investor briefing. In the remaining tapes, we'll be able to interact and play through the environment in order to progress the story. The first sets us within Mountain View Primary School, where a long hallway stretches out before us as a bell or fire alarm can be heard going off. There's nothing in here but a note left behind in an open locker, which we'll need to keep in mind for later. Alice, do you want to go play at the cabins after school again? It's so fun. I just realized that you don't poof to the cabins that are already open. This will change the game of tag forever. Tape number 2, The Looker, brings us to a weird old house with a giant antenna on top. There's nothing we can do here now, but we may make a mental note of a locked bulkhead door in the back before proceeding to tape 4, Security Room. This tape is interesting because we can see that the house from The Looker is located in the distance, and inside of the small Scepter security shack, there are a few hints to find. One is an image that references back to tape 2, and the other, a floppy disk found in this filing cabinet, which triggers a jump scare wherein a strange shadowy figure looks in at us from outside the window. I have no explanation for this. Like, even knowing how this game plays out, I'm still confused by it. So, I don't know, keep this in mind, maybe one of you can piece this together better than I can. If we insert the floppy disk into the computer terminal, we'll find that there's a code needed to access something called an overwrite key. That doesn't make sense to us now, but it will in just a moment. Before heading back to tape 2, we can take a brief look at the final tape, the cabin anomaly. But we can't find anything yet because of this red beam, so the only way forward is to visit the rock shown in the photo from before, and now we'll find a key there, which opens the padlock on the bulkhead and finally allows us to head inside. There's some dark hallways down here, and at the end of them a computer terminal, upon which we can read a message from a staff member of Scepter. It's addressed to George Booker from Alfred Raphael, and it's dated November 28th, 1983, at just 12 minutes to midnight. This is how we know approximately when the game takes place, and it's the earliest date we see in any of Mike Klubnika's games. George, I'm sending this to you from The Looker, in the hope that it does not find me here. Put the cabin anomaly on full lockdown. Hell, if I were you, I would put the pulse sonar down. So I guess we know what that red beam is. The second part of the message offers us a security code, 4142, which we can use in tape 4 to access the computer and shut off the pulse sonar, making our final tape, the cabin anomaly, accessible at last. When checking the tape again, we find ourselves in a Scepter-owned facility that seems to have been ransacked sometime before our arrival. Proceeding up the stairs to the observatory reveals only a locked door, so we backtrack until we find another door, which was previously closed, now open before it flies shut again. And just beyond that is a set of lockers, with one chamber open to reveal a key. We can use it to unlock the observatory, and as we head in and flick on the yard lights, we see the cabins from the investor briefing, and to the left on a table, a note left over by Alfred. Most of the financiers are simply not interested in the unmarked location, and if I'm being completely honest, it might not even exist. Our best option right now is to try moving one of the cabins. It could prove to be a revolutionary way of transport. I'll assemble a team for Tuesday. From here, if we leave the control room and enter the now open elevator, we can make our way down to the first floor, and exit the hall out into the ring of cabins. Now, we have to remember that note we found all the way back in the primary school. We can't teleport to any of the cabins with open doors, so by opening each of the cabin doors except one, which we close behind us, we find ourselves at the unmarked location. It's not clear where or when this place actually exists, but stepping away from the cabin and turning back, we'll find that it's not there at all, but in its place is this. A diagram showing the house from the looker and the symbol in the center of the cabins. Now the screen goes black, and we find ourselves in a red-tinted domain with the same hexagonal floors as the previous area. The missing cabin is at the end of a long series of torches, and as we begin to make our way over, the torches go out, with a number of nameless people walking towards us from the dark, before static, a scene of the stars, and we're at last brought to this building, the Scepter facility, now abandoned. As we head inside, we see that the elevator is no longer operational, though the door that was previously closed in front of us now hangs open, and inside is us, hanging from the ceiling, a box of tapes in front of us. That's where the game ends. We're told in the closing sequence that we watch the tapes over and over again, so many times in fact that they wear out entirely, and all that's left are distant memories. Thus concludes Unsorted VHS. In truth, this game is mostly a standalone one in the Mike Klubnika library. Aside from a general atmosphere of eeriness, there's not a ton of correlation between this game and the rest of our perspective timeline, but the overall mood, visual style, and the reveal at the end are very telling of what we're yet to experience as we press forward. Bear in mind the essence of biomechanical, psychological, and cosmic horror found within this game, and how they're all kind of blended together. These are three areas that Klubnika explores a lot within subsequent entries that we can expect to see again, even as soon as our next game, the only other paid Klubnika experience. You know it, you love it. It's pretty convenient that the place where this whole mystery began is also likely one of the first to occur, as it's assumed to take place somewhere in or around the year 1998, as evidenced by the screen of the burner phone item and a couple of leads from the game's ARG, which, once again, I talked about in this video. Because I've already covered most of the game's emerging story not too long ago, and because I'm fairly sure that most viewers are already pretty familiar with what is undoubtedly Mike's most popular game, I'm going to be rather brief when going over this one. Buckshot Roulette revolves around our unnamed player character, who starts off the game in a dingy nightclub bathroom, before heading out to face this strange humanoid figure known only as the Dealer, as we participate in a game of, well, Buckshot Roulette, which is, as I described in the intro, basically just Russian roulette but with a shotgun. The thing is that in this world, catching a shell doesn't necessarily mean the end of the game. Through some sort of unknown restorative technology, which takes the form of a sort of defibrillator, we can be brought back from the brink multiple times, and thus we get the feeling that the game is almost engineered to be as adrenaline pumping as possible, perhaps in order to satiate the dealer's own twisted mind somehow. It's unclear. What we do learn, partially through Buckshot Roulette's story, is that we're not the first person who the dealer has versed, as in the second item pull of the game's story mode, we find an old waiver not unlike the one we had to sign at the beginning of the game, this time belonging to a character known only as God. There's been some debate on whether or not this is just a person naming themselves God, or whether it was an actual factual deity, but it seems that the latter of these two options was confirmed by Klubnika himself in that Q&A interview mentioned earlier. Who is God? What was his reason for playing the dealer? Is he dead? God is just your average creator of the universe type of guy. Made a bet with the dealer and all hell broke loose. Literally. Yet he's super dead. So, although as I've outlined in the past, the specifics of what's going on beyond the walls of the nightclub in this game are wholly unknown given what we know at this point, one might theorize that it was the dealer's actions, or more accurately, the challenge and ultimate defeat of the deity alluded to in the game, that ultimately led to a lot of the subsequent horror, which we're going to get into soon. But before we do that, I also want to briefly bring up Volta Standard Electronics, a fictional technologies company responsible for manufacturing the line of devices known as the Kony series. This includes the biomechanical computer monitor that we see in the nightclub bathroom, but also the Kony Ericsson, which is the brand of the game's flip phone, and which we can learn more about on the real-life website voltastandardelectronics.com, which is connected to the Buckshot Roulette ARG. Some of the Steam trading cards also make mention that Volta has descended down a dark path of sorts, and while it's difficult to know exactly what that means, I think it's definitely worth keeping in mind, especially as we approach our next title. Tartarus Engine is a game exclusive to Unsorted Horror, a greatest hits style collection of some of Mike's most prolific games, which was made available for free on both itch.io and Steam. While all four of the other titles in the collection were originally released standalone, Tartarus Engine can only be played from this collection, and it's a title that plays more like an interactive short film than a bona fide game, which naturally means I absolutely loved it. Taking place in 2009, the premise is that humanity has created a vast Matrix-esque machine capable of perfectly simulating alternate versions of reality. Whether those realities be for pleasure or pain, though, is completely up to the user's discretion. But for the most part, it seems like the machine, the Tartarus Engine as it's called, is being used as part of a virtual containment program in the prison industrial complex. However, your player character, Harper, and a group of Tartarus Engine technicians have developed a genius plan. By injecting your own simulation tailored to your personal desires, the Tartarus Engine can be used to simulate a utopia just as easily as it can a hellscape. And what's more, it's found that by opening one simulation inside the next, Inception style, time will dilate further and further in each consecutive instance, to the point where a single moment in the waking world will translate to a near eternity in the simulation. Not only can you attend your perfect utopia, but you can perceive your time there as being close to infinity. With this plan in mind, the crew essentially perform a reverse reverse prison break, and you're tasked with replacing one of the prison drives with your own drive that holds the simulation before the clock strikes midnight. This is where the first and only section of true gameplay takes place, and it follows a tried and true Klubnika formula of having a player use tools they're provided to assemble or disassemble something. We're going to see a lot of that style of gameplay as this video continues too. Once the work is done, you head up to meet the rest of the team right as they're strapping into the engine, and everything seems to be going pretty well until the cascade fails. One of the technicians, the one who was responsible for setting up the device, forgot to disable something, and so the perfect simulation fails and instead sends you and your friends into a nauseating loop of further dilation instances, at least until they're found by someone who can force them back to reality. Realistically, that could only take a few minutes or hours, but to the techs, it'll be a near eternity of sitting, waiting in this closed system. A cruel simulation indeed. That's basically all there is to the Tartarus engine story, but nevertheless, some parallels to Buckshot Roulette are certainly clear. In my previous video, I had many people comment their own thoughts with regard to the story of that game, and one of the comments that I saw most often was the interpretation that the events of Buckshot Roulette could take place within one of these simulated realities of the Tartarus engine. This was something that was brought up many times, and while theoretically that could be true, I'm somewhat inclined to disagree. Now, to be clear, there's no real reason to think one way or another about this. It very well could be the case that the whole game of Buckshot Roulette is just one of many simulations adopted by the machine. But truthfully, I don't think we ever get a look inside any of these simulations aside from the one presented as a test, where the people inside would be expected to peel potatoes forever, which is admittedly kind of funny. Once again, I want to emphasize that I don't really have any proof for or against this point, and because this whole video is essentially speculation tying a lot of these games together, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea and think I'm saying definitively that none of the other games take place within the simulation. I don't know if that's true. What I do think is that the dates we have to string these games together reveal a larger overarching plot which, to me at least, seems like it could be intentional. So I want to follow that thread to its logical conclusion. And with this in mind, it's perhaps no wonder that the next game in the timeline seems to build upon a lot of the same themes of Tartarus Engine, even though it actually came out long beforehand. And that game is... As its description states, Inferneural is not a game that relies on traditional horror hooks like jump scares or spooky images to evoke suspense. And indeed, if you were to give this game to someone without the preconception that it's a horror game, it might actually take them a little while to realize it. Inferneural opens in an area that's very unlike many of the other locations that we see in Mike's games. A town or city on the coast that seems warm and inviting in spite of its polygonal graphics. I heard some compare this area to Vice City, based purely on looks, and I'm not gonna lie, that was the first thing that came to my mind too. In the game, our character has signed up to partake in a study or test performed by a company called Inferneural, known as the Eternal Captcha program. One day, we arrive at their facility by bus, where we're greeted by a mostly empty room with the exception of a small table holding a note and a coffee vending machine. Thank you for signing up to the Inferneural Eternal Captcha program. As stated in page 987, paragraph 2 of the contract, the coffee has anesthetic properties. After drinking it, step into the automatic escort vehicle and relax. If you find yourself not remembering the contents of the test after it's finished, do not be alarmed. This is a side effect of the beverage. Inferneural, innovative AI solutions. Well, okay, that sounds simple enough. We hit the button on the coffee machine, and while we wait for it to brew, we look at the poster on the far wall, which offers a little bit more information about the program in question. Here, we're told that our consciousness will be placed into an artificial body while the study is conducted, because only an artificial body has the capacity to not degrade within the confines of the warp drive, a piece of technology that acts as a sort of pocket dimension, where 1 minute of real-world time translates to about 10 years. We're once again back to the time dilation stuff, and just based off of that, you might be able to guess some of the things I'm going to bring up once we're done talking about this game. But for now, our coffee is ready, so we have a choice. Do we drink it, or do we not? If we do decide to follow the instructions, then we won't remember anything from our time in the program. We simply sip the coffee down, and then we're right back over here. Leaving the building, we join another participant who's sitting outside looking at the ocean. He greets you, saying that he also just got done a few minutes before, and remarks how conceptually interesting the experiment was. Isn't it crazy? We are gone for 5 minutes, but over there, it's 50 years. Warp drives really are fascinating. But the conversation shifts suddenly when the man says he's curious about what really happened in that span of time. He says that he knows some who remembered, and then very nonchalantly tells us that, well, upon getting out, they didn't stick around for long, let's put it like that. So it is that we've reached the first of the game's 2 endings, Ignorance is Bliss. In this timeline, we get paid the next day, retire, and live the rest of our lives in peace. That sounds pretty great, and it's almost enough to quell our curiosity about just what happens in the Eternal Captcha. And if you really want to find out, it's as simple as not drinking the coffee. In this route, the door opens just beyond the table in the lobby, and as we step inside, we're lowered down to what we presume to be the warp drive. After this, we find what awaits us inside. A computer monitor and a brief questionnaire consisting of 9 million questions. This is where the true horror of Inferneural lies. 50 years, over half an average human life spent answering survey questions, and to make matters worse, answering incorrectly will result in a penalty of 50,000 questions. This segment of the game is obviously scripted, so we only need to answer a few questions before the task is done, but bear in mind that between these cuts, tens of years have passed from our character's perspective. It's a very unsettling premise. At last, though, we answer the final question, our session concludes, and we're finally allowed to leave. As we do, overlooking the thousands of cubicles full of participants just like us. Needless to say, we aren't the same when we get back to reality this time. The man on the bench picks up on it right away, and as the ending plays, it's revealed that our unnamed character seems to follow in the footsteps of the other participants that the man knew. But regardless, I think one thing is clear. Warp drive technology seems very much like a logical extension of the Tartarus engine tech. It's unclear exactly what Inferneural wants with the data gleaned from the questionnaires, but evidently they need a lot of it, and so it does admittedly make sense to perform their study within a simulated environment. I would reckon this is probably what the poster meant by transferring our consciousness into an artificial body. It's not much different from the prisoners we see in the Tartarus engine, and to Inferneural's credit, the company has realistically taken precautions to prevent the sort of trauma that our main character undergoes. The coffee numbs us to the whole experience, so if we were to follow orders, no damage would come to the body or the mind. It's safe, even if admittedly sort of unsettling. Regardless, we only know that this game takes place next in our timeline due to a date seen on the boot screen of the computer inside the Eternal Captcha, which tells the date both inside and outside the warp drive. It's here that we learn the Earth date to be June 5th, 2022. That's less than a month after the real-world release date of this game, too, which is kind of cute. From here, though, we're going to be taking a leap 16 years into the future, as we get to what is certainly one of Mike's stranger games, but maybe not for the reasons you would have expected. Yuletide Machine is a game exclusively playable from the 4th Madvent Calendar Collection, which is, or at least was, a yearly event organized by the same people behind Haunted PS1, which is a phenomenon that I've really wanted to talk about on this channel for a while, but, you know, maybe I'll make a Halloween special of it or something. Basically, the goal of this program is to highlight and celebrate short, low-poly horror games from around the internet, by collaborating with creators to put out the aforementioned Haunted PS1 demo disc every year around Halloween, and the downloadable Madvent calendars in December, near the holiday season. The idea behind Madvent is very simple. Each yearly release includes 25 games that are meant to be played in a one-a-day Advent calendar style format from December 1st to Christmas Day. And in the most recent of these, Mike Klubnika created Yuletide Machine, which was to be played on day number 7. Although it retains many of the darker themes standard among Klubnika's works, it's safe to say that it's definitely one of his more whimsical satirical or satirical games. The premise is that Santa's sleigh, which contrary to popular belief is not powered by magical reindeer, but instead by a massive V-style engine, is running out of fuel, and as an elf working at the industrial propellant facility, it's up to you to mix up a new batch of fuel for Santa to pick up during his pit stop, or he'll be very angry. The game's very short, even for a Klubnika release, and just involves assembling the correct ingredients and placing them within the giant crucible at the room's center. But as funny and seemingly absurd as this premise sounds, there's reason to believe that this game does actually fit along our theoretical timeline, since a calendar on the wall plainly details that it's Christmas night in the year 2038. Oh, and also both this calendar and the little poster on the wall that proudly details that it's been exactly 0 days without a workplace accident were also apparently produced by Kony, which if you'll remember is a brand owned by Volta Standard Electronics, all the way back from the world of Buckshot Roulette, meaning that 40 years after their first appearance, Volta is apparently still around. Who knows what kind of technologies they've had a hand in helping to produce at this point. Maybe Volta was partly or wholly responsible for the creation of the Tartarus engine. Maybe Inferneural is another one of their brands along with Kony, who's to say? I mean, if these items are branded this way, it may even insinuate that the propellant factory itself is property of Kony, and therefore property of Volta, so I really don't know what to think anymore. Mike, on the off chance that you ever end up seeing this, please, I have to know, is Volta responsible for creating Santa's sleigh? I think if so, that would just about be the best lore discovery we've ever made on this channel. But as crazy as all of that may sound, we still have a handful of other games to go through before this tentative timeline can be complete. So now, how about a big tonal shift? Control Room Alpha is a game where we work as a crane operator responsible for extracting some kind of mysterious samples out of a nest of giant spiders. The game takes place in the year 2047, as we can see to the left of the crane control panel, and this is the start of where we see some of the truly cosmic horror elements take center stage in Klubnika's games, and largely replace a lot of the time dilation or simulation theory stuff that we've talked about up until this point. The game starts off with us collecting our first sample and getting used to using the crane as one of the giant spiders scurries by, putting a large crack in the glass of our enclosure. But as we're about to bring the second of the 4 samples over to the rack which holds them, the crane somehow malfunctions and the sample is dropped to the floor of the cave. Our supervisor, who's been overseeing the extraction, seems a little bit put off by this, probably in no small part because we've just been told to exercise extreme caution when extracting these samples, since each one is valued at over 1 million Vietnamese dong. That sounds like quite a lot of money, even though, well, you can make up your own mind about that. Either way though, in a bid to make things right, we're asked to proceed out the bulkhead door to the right-hand side of the facility, and make our way down to the pit in order to secure the sample and place it on the rig manually. We obey these orders in spite of the giant warning sign, which very eloquently lets us know what we're in for, and contrary to what you might be expecting, nothing happens to us out here. We're actually okay. Well, for a second, we might have even thought we were in the clear after that, but this is a Mike Klubnika game, so you know something's going to go wrong.
Good job, comrade. We might not have gotten all the sample, but for the first time... What? What is that? Is that some type of...
In spite of its brevity, Control Room Alpha is, I think, one of my favorite games in this whole selection. I can't pinpoint exactly why, but I really enjoyed the dark underground setting. I can imagine it taking place in some kind of abandoned mine or strange cavern of sorts, and as I said in the beginning, there's a lot of cosmic horror vibes that we get here, even though we don't really see anything directly related to cosmic horror until the very end. While playing through it, I was reminded a lot of Gemini Home Entertainment, an analog horror series that you might be familiar with if you're into that kind of stuff. I would highly recommend it, it's very cool, and I think anyone who's seen it can probably attest to the vibes being sort of similar. But in addition, I like some of the humor that was added to this game. Between the goofy narrator, the overblown value of the samples, and the exit sign, there's a lot of stuff that really did make me chuckle, and we don't really see that in a lot of Mike's other games. I think it was incorporated really well into this experience, and didn't take away from the tension either. If anything, it really added to it, and luckily, we're going to be seeing a little bit more of that in our next game. Just 2 years after the events of Control Room Alpha in the year 2049, as seen on this computer terminal, system upkeep takes place entirely aboard a spaceship on its way to detonate a bomb on an alien planet after misunderstood negotiations led to the entire human race being at risk. Our job is to fuel the ship with coal, keep it on course using the nav and transit computer, and of course to brew ourselves some coffee so that we can keep our energy up throughout the whole thing. It doesn't seem like much, but there's a lot to remember here, and a lot of things to pay attention to simultaneously. Mike actually has a playthrough of his own uploaded to his YouTube channel, and it's really quite impressive, I'm not gonna lie. It just goes to show how fast-paced this game can really get. Things start off slowly, letting you get your bearings for one piece of the ship at a time, but once we get close to the planet, things get more difficult, and we have to focus on a lot simultaneously. If we manage to keep it up long enough though, we'll be awarded with a sweet little cutscene showing the planet exploding and insinuating that we've saved humanity, which is pretty sweet. I don't really have a lot to say about system upkeep other than the fact that it takes place in the year 2049, so it makes its way into the timeline. I have my own theories about these aliens, but nothing conclusive certainly, so I'm going to leave that for the end of the video, and for now we're just going to move into the next game. I'm going to be upfront with you on this one. This time and date comes from a set of emails that we received throughout the game taking place sometime in '98. And this might sound really silly, but I genuinely am not sure if, given everything we've discussed, I should take this to mean 1998, the same year as Buckshot Roulette, or 2098, which, as far-fetched as it might sound, almost makes a bit more sense thematically, as I think we'll soon see. Carbon Steel opens with our player character handing over their papers at some kind of customs booth located, well, I don't know exactly where, before they're shuttled off to a facility where a worker is conducting some maintenance. At the center of the room is an old-school computer monitor upon which we've received an email from Anon. Greetings from the research team. You will be carrying out the main sample pull from the pit, which hosts a multitude of pressure-treated organisms. After the pull is successfully completed, you will hand the data over to the team. As we discussed, this job will take a total of 3 days. We are still in the middle of setting up some of the equipment. Please enter your holding cell. And so we do, the holding cell being a small room off to the left-hand side of the facility with some very poor amenities, including a mirror that's so grimy that we can't see through it, and a bed with no sheets or comforter on it. If we interact with the bed, we'll go to sleep and dream of a bright blue sky before waking to the alarm which alerts us that it's time to get to work. Back in the main room, we start off by initiating the pull on the container housing whatever organism we're drawing up from the pit. Here, there will be an array of information about the organism, but the ones that are important are the weight, class, and subclass. From these, we can reference a selection of floppy disks near the main computer, which will in turn give us the proper combination of chemicals needed in order to synthesize a sedative. Next, we head over to this stand and add the appropriate chemicals before placing it on a rig in the center of the room that injects the serum into the container and sedates the creature. Next, we use a data canister in conjunction with the rig to retrieve whatever information the research team is hoping to extract. This takes the form of a weird red orb that pulses and buzzes from the center of the container. One can't help but be reminded of the canisters from Control Room Alpha, but I digress. After this, all that's left is to hand the sample through this opening and our day is done. Before waking up on the second day, we dream of a strange mass of eyes emerging from the container in the center of the room. And after the buzzer wakes us up, we also find that we've got a new subtask to add to the mix. No longer will the class and subclass be provided for us at the beginning of the pull. Instead, we now have to use a new tool to scan the creature and complete a short set of puzzles in order to narrow down what the class and subclass are. From here, the rest of the operation goes as usual. On the final day, we pull up a creature from a much deeper point in the pit than we had previously, and as a result, it's much more violent. Of course, that in turn means another new task, as we need to use this device to continually repair the container while finding that class and subclass and eventually brewing the sedative. It's honestly not too difficult, and if at any point we find ourselves messing up, then the game plays off our failure as if it were just another bad dream, and we'll start the day over again at the sound of the buzzer, which I think is a really clever and interesting use of that bit of narrative. If we manage to complete all 3 days of our job though, we'll awaken on the 4th day to find a final email sent to our inbox. We just finished reviewing the final data poll. Indeed, your work has proven to us that the risk is justified by the benefits. Excellent work. However, compared to ourselves, the life forms we have previously studied are significantly less advanced. We believe that a human body would yield far more interesting results. You will have the honor of being the first pressure-treated human. Please remain seated. As we try and close the email, we're tased or sedated somehow before we awaken inside the same canisters we'd previously pulled from the pit. Our fate beyond this point is unknown. Carbon Steel is a great game, and in my opinion probably the most fleshed out that Mike's classic task-managing formula has ever been. It's entertaining, mildly challenging, and all the while it makes us think about the game world and how we find ourselves in this situation to begin with. I think there's an obvious parallel between the creatures in Carbon Steel and the spiders from Control Room Alpha, and aside from the collection of glowing red samples being an important facet in each experience, there's also the pit to reckon with. And this is the reason why I would personally say that there's a good chance to be made that Carbon Steel takes place after Control Room Alpha and not before. It seems to me like research around these creatures found deep underground has intensified. The operation has gone up drastically in scale within Carbon Steel as opposed to the previous game, where it almost seemed like that pit was only being studied or monitored by a small team at best. Now, to be clear, we don't have any confirmation that the hole in Control Room Alpha and the pit in Carbon Steel are in fact the same thing, but I'd say that they're so close thematically that even if they're not literally the same location, I would reckon that they're at least demonstrative of the same phenomenon. The facility in Carbon Steel is massive compared to that in Control Room Alpha, based off of the trolley system at the beginning of the game, which suggests that research is being conducted throughout this facility simultaneously. The question of what that research is, though, is completely unknown. Once again, I have my own theories, but before we get into that, we have to take a look at our final game. In the game The Other Side, we adopt the role of a settler in a large underground bunker, which, according to the game's description, was built thousands of years before, which almost certainly means that The Other Side takes place in the far future from anything else that we've talked about today. The game itself is another task manager of sorts, in the same style as Carbon Steel. In this one, however, we have to manage a drill, which we're using to punch through a piece of the bunker wall and escape to the outside world. Throughout the game, we'll need to replace the oil and coolant, recharge the drill battery, and insert new drill bits in order to keep the machine operational. There are two layers of the bunker wall to get through. The first one is very low risk, and it supplies us with time to get our bearings and figure out how the equipment works. The second layer, though, alerts bunker security if it's penetrated in any way. So what this means in terms of gameplay is that from this point on, we have 5 minutes to complete a full cycle of the drill, which is the amount of time it would take for security to reach us. If you know what you're doing, this is very doable, although it will feel pretty tense as you watch that timer slowly tick down minute over minute. Eventually, though, we've done it, and as we push out the wall that we've drilled away at, we see a green pastoral field with a lone tree sitting in the distance. It's quite the satisfying sight, even in this low-poly environment, but if we reach that tree, there's a note waiting for us. This place isn't what it The rest of the note is unintelligible, and with that, this beautiful scene is interrupted by a monster. Over the horizon, a massive, spider-like creature approaches at rapid speed. With our distance from the bunker and the slow pace at which we move, it's impossible for us to get back to the shelter before the creature reaches the tree, and when it does, the game is over. Those of you that are interested in sci-fi literature may have realized that this game closely parallels Hugh Howey's book Wool, a part of his greater Silo series, which is directly stated as an inspiration within the credits. This is a story where, in the distant future, the remnants of humanity take up residence within a 144-floored city known as the Silo. Here, people are told that the world outside is deadly, and anyone who doesn't believe it is given the opportunity to go out and see for themselves. But much like The Other Side, it seems there's actually a reason that people are kept in this facility, as the outside world really is a dangerous place. This is the last Klubnika game that comes with any hint of a time frame in which it might exist, but before we round this out, I want to briefly discuss one more game because I think there's a chance, albeit a small one, that the ending of The Other Side can be illuminated somewhat by this title. Relatively speaking, Core is an earlier one of Mike's works with respect to the rest of those that we've talked about today. Though I wouldn't consider it one of his first games by any extent, it is the second earliest, aside from system upkeep, that we've looked at in this video. And like many of the others, this game follows a simple formula. Core revolves around an unnamed protagonist who eagerly seeks something known only as the core as they navigate the internals of a massive industrial superstructure. Throughout the game, we have to avoid these spider-like creatures called sentinels, which presumably guard the core, which turns out to be a giant mechanical organ of some kind. The story of Core is opaque and enigmatic, which is a large part of the title's mystique, but what I want to focus on here are the Sentinels. I think that if this game is connected to the others in any way, it's more than likely that the Sentinels have something to do with it. Consider the form of the creature on the surface in the other side. It sort of resembles the arachnoid body plan, if not with a few additional appendages. But the other thing that sticks out to me here is the environment. It's easy to imagine that the structure we navigate through in Core may not be all that dissimilar to the shelter in the other side. Although the Sentinels are perceived to be guarding the core somehow, we don't really know why, or even if that's necessarily their true motivation. Nor do we know the specifics of how that relationship could have developed. Could it be that this is a shelter that's been overrun by a species that plagues the outside world, but which, through a breach of some kind, made their way in and took up refuge? Could it even be that Core potentially alludes to the fate of the same shelter from the other side, after we leave it wide open for invasion? I'm not sure that I necessarily believe this theory, but I think it's an interesting train of thought that I wanted to share either way. Earlier when we talked about Control Room Alpha and system upkeep, I also alluded to a couple of theories regarding the extraterrestrial or supernatural phenomenon occurring in those games, and if you haven't guessed by now, then my theory is that these sentinel spider creatures are potentially connected to those phenomena as well, but clearly there's not a whole lot to back up these assumptions. I just wanted to sort of put it out there because I'm just getting the feeling that there's more to these creatures than we currently know, and truthfully, I'm wondering if anyone who sees this video might have some idea about this that I haven't come up with, whether it's a piece of circumstantial evidence which might help to solidify this connection, or something that rules it out entirely. So here we have it, my proposition of what a timeline for the Mike Klubnika extended universe might look like. There are some parts that probably aren't completely right, or don't make a lot of sense, but I thought this was a fun, worthwhile thought experiment, and frankly, I'm surprised to find so many thematically similar games occupy adjacent points in this chronology. If nothing else, this bizarre delve into the lore of these worlds is a testament to KLUBNIKA'S incredible facility at developing compelling works of horror fiction. Like I said before, there are certainly areas of my interpretation that could be put to some greater scrutiny, or that you simply might not agree with at all, and that's completely okay. Ultimately, just like my previous video about one of KLUBNIKA'S games, my goal here, more than anything, is to inspire conversation and friendly debate about these beautifully unsettling worlds. If you have any thoughts on any of Mike's games, maybe even one of those that I haven't discussed within this video, then I'd love to hear about it in the comments. As you guys know, this is the kind of storytelling that's really exciting to me. I had a lot of fun putting this video together, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it or got something out of it too. In addition, I want to give a big thanks to Mike for allowing me to talk about his games today. I'll have his itch.io page linked in the description. A lot of his games are completely free to play with the option to donate if you want to, so please go check him out. And also, another big thank you to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this episode. If you want to help out the channel and jump on some of the awesome rewards Raid is offering while you still can, it's completely free to play, and everyone who uses my link is greatly appreciated. My deepest thanks to both Raid and to you for supporting this channel. With that though, this is Everberon, I'll see you again soon, and have a good one.